Hey friends, before we get started, I'd really appreciate it if you could subscribe, like, and leave a comment. It would help the video out a lot, and it's an easy thing for you to do but means a lot to us. Thanks in advance. I had to photocopy some stuff and spread the letters all over the city. You'll understand why I didn't go to the police a bit later. Sorry if this comes off a bit jumbled, my hands are still shaking. I thought I was done with everything behind me, but I guess I was wrong. Anyway, let me get to the point. First, a quick intro about myself. My name is Hassan. I'm from a small village in the Toronto region, and I moved to this city not too long ago. Back home, I finished school, went to medical university, and worked as a pathologist. Honestly, I'm still just a student at heart. I was pretty mediocre, so they only trusted me to do autopsies on obvious cases, like old folks who died of old age or long illnesses. But honestly, that was enough for me to admit to myself that I never really had a strong work ethic or aimed for the stars. Watching my colleagues sometimes handle 5 or 6 autopsies in a shift, I felt a bit relieved. I often showed up to work, just sipping tea, and I actually enjoyed my laid-back job. It was fine for a while, but then everything changed. It all kicked off on one of those lovely June days. I was heading home in the evening after my day shift, completely wiped out. Everything was piling up on me. The heat was unbearable, which I just can't handle, and the ongoing renovations at our morgue. About 2 weeks ago, they started replacing the roof on the 2nd floor, leaving a massive hole in the ceiling. Whenever it rained, we had to put out buckets and even drain the toilet to manage the water. But work didn't stop. We have the only morgue in the whole city, and we share the building with. I was working as a forensic expert along with the coroner, and we, as regular pathologists, were just pushing through, sometimes cursing a bit. Water was dripping through a hole in the roof, but hey, it was a dry summer, and the rain didn't come often. Anyway, I got a bit carried away there. Let me get to the point. Totally exhausted, I was on the minibus heading home, lost in my thoughts. I got off at my stop and nearly bumped into this strange guy. Despite the crazy heat, he was dressed in a long black cloak, and his face was hidden under a wide-brimmed hat. Actually, he was leaning so far forward it was hard to see him. I couldn't see his face, and I was so taken aback that I ended up apologizing, even though this stranger was the one blocking the way. The guy didn't say anything or react at all. He just stood there, probably thinking I was just another weirdo in the city. I hurried off toward home, and when I looked back, he was already gone. It was only about 5 seconds, and I couldn't wrap my head around how he vanished so fast. I kept walking, but later I found out how he pulled it off. I still can't wrap my head around how he managed to do that right in front of other passersby. When I got home and had dinner, I went to bed, but I was jolted awake in the middle of the night by something heavy hitting my window ledge. At first, I didn't even realize where the noise was coming from. But then it happened again. Something hefty thudded against the side of the window, like a big bird had landed on the sill or was walking around up there. I jumped out of bed and rushed to the living room, but it was so dark that I could barely see, and I was still groggy from sleep. But I swear, there was a huge black silhouette sitting on my window ledge. As soon as I found myself in the middle of the room, something flapped its wings, jumped off the ledge and disappeared into the darkness. For a brief moment, I was stunned. I blinked, and waking up, I thought maybe it was just the heat and the damn renovations playing tricks on me, or maybe it was just an owl on the windowsill that I had never seen but thought was pretty big. I waved it off and went back to sleep since I had another shift the next night. When I got to work, I noticed some commotion at the door of the morgue. There had been an emergency. A young body had been stolen. The guy just vanished without a trace. They called the police, and investigators, but they were more of a hassle with their questions. Nobody saw or heard anything. It was like the guy just evaporated. They halted the repair work, just like the autopsy, saying it would be on hold for a day. That night, a young sergeant stayed with me, supposedly for protection, but he kept asking really weird questions. He wanted to know if I had seen or heard anything and was curious about my colleagues, asking if anyone had been acting shady or anything like that. But there was nothing like that. And then his questions just faded away. I was feeling overwhelmed, so I boldly turned on YouTube on my phone, plugged in my headphones, and started watching something dark. The night shift passed, and in the morning, a bit tired, I switched out and hopped on a minibus. After I got off at my stop, I headed home, and to my surprise, I saw that same stranger in the coat and hat again, not far from my place. This time, I stopped and took a good look at him. I had the feeling he was watching me. The stranger stood still, leaning his head forward, but then, for about 5 seconds, he suddenly looked up and stared at me. His gaze sent chills down my arms, and I felt cold sweat on my back. Even from a decent distance, I could see his cold, lifeless, light gray eyes, more specifically, the irises. His skin was unnaturally pale, almost ashen. But the weirdest part was the complete lack of any facial hair, including eyebrows. His icy, unblinking, and really unsettling stare made me uneasy. And after that, something happened that made me hurriedly head home. Switching to running, how do I even describe it? If I were a writer, I'd find the right words. But I'm just a regular pathologist, a mediocre student who never liked books. So this stranger looked up a couple of times and sniffed the air, like he was trying to catch a scent. Honestly, I've never been brave and always avoided conflicts. After breakfast at home, I spent the whole day binge-watching comedies. To be honest, I'm not really into horror films. I never understood why people enjoy being scared. They reminded me of masochists, sitting there trembling with fear and getting a kick out of it. Strange people. Later in the evening, I went to the store to get some food to cook. I'm not really a fan of cooking. My natural laziness probably plays a big role in that. I ended up buying either dumplings or pierogi. Can't remember exactly. After a hearty dinner, I went to bed. In the middle of the night, I was jolted awake by a weird noise, but this time it was different. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up again to a thud against the window, something heavy, as if it was trying to scare me on purpose. It knocked several times. It was quiet for a few minutes. Then things started to get strange. Something began moving along the windowsill. I could clearly hear the siding crunching underneath it. Considering I have plastic windows, the noise should have been loud enough for the whole courtyard to hear, especially since I live on the 6th floor of an old panel building. And as we know, sound travels better from above. I was about to get up, but then I just lay there, frozen, neither alive nor dead, as something started scratching the glass with its claws or whatever it had instead, making these monotonous, piercing sounds. The dark apartment was filled with fear, and I felt like a little kid, shaking with terror, pulling the blanket up to my chin. I was literally trembling with fright. But despite being naturally such a coward, I managed to pull myself together and decided to face my fear. I kept telling myself it was just an owl or some other big bird. Shaking on shaky legs, I crawled out from under the blanket and slowly made my way to the living room. But as soon as I reached the middle of the room, it jumped off the windowsill. And for a split second, I saw it flying away from my window. The silhouette was just like last time. Back in the bedroom, I spent a long time convincing myself it was nothing but a huge bird, or just a regular hallucination from the heat and stress at work. I was simply too scared to admit to myself that I was facing something terrifying. Honestly, until that moment, I didn't believe in the supernatural or anything weird. What a fool I was. If I had known what was coming, I would have dropped everything that morning and just run wherever my eyes took me. as far away from that cursed hometown as possible. The weekend went by quietly. I was just chilling, watching the copper soak. Besides the store, the day shift went by pretty smoothly. Work didn't really kick off, and no one was doing any autopsies. Even though fresh bodies were coming in, the coolers were already half full, and the relatives were getting anxious. But the plainclothes officers made it very clear to us to keep our mouths shut. That's another reason I didn't go to the police. Instead, I printed a bunch of the same letters and spread them around the city. I just want to warn the residents about what they might have to deal with, or rather, who they might have to deal with. The worst experience I had was during the night shift, and I won't go into details about that. When I got to work, to my pleasant surprise, I found out the police were there for the day. At first I was happy, not knowing what was coming next. Another bit of good news was that fresh bodies were now being sent to the local clinic for holding or some other purpose that I wasn't briefed on. Plus, the crime scene investigators and forensic experts were also moved to the same hospital, leaving only the pathologists behind to keep watch, which is what I ended up being. I was so glad to be alone in the morgue that I locked all the doors, poured myself some tea, and flopped down in the chair. I started dozing off and not thinking much of it. I laid down on the couch and quickly fell asleep. After midnight, I woke up to a loud thud on the ceiling, like someone had jumped on the second floor and dropped something heavy. I jumped off the couch and instinctively grabbed my phone. But then I calmed myself down and decided to check it out myself. I was just afraid that the newly done repairs on the second floor had come apart again, and I didn't want to be accused of being a coward. I knew the fine for a false alarm was still in effect. Stuffing my phone in my pocket, I walked up to the door and pressed my ear against it to listen. At first, there was this heavy silence, but then I started hearing strange sounds. Maybe footsteps or a shuffling noise. They were monotonous and, to my horror, getting louder as they got closer. Then, just about 5 minutes in, they suddenly stopped. And, to my utter stupidity, I thought it would be a good idea to go check it out. I have no idea where that dumb thought came from. I should have just called the cops and stayed put. I opened the door without showing my face and peeked into the dimly lit hallway of the morgue. The old lights hummed loudly, barely lighting up the place, and just my luck, one of them went out again. Listening intently, I was surprised to realize that the sound hadn't gone away. It was coming from the room with the refrigeration units. From where we stored the pipes, I heard a metal screech, and then everything went silent. I stared into the darkness for at least 5 minutes, and then I couldn't come up with anything better to do than go check it out myself. It was happening in the cold storage room. As soon as I stepped inside, that same stranger in the cloak came out from around the corner, holding a dead girl in his arms. I barely held back a scream. Luckily, he either didn't notice me or pretended not to. I'm not really sure anymore. He slowly started making his way up to the second floor, and that's when I realized what those strange sounds were. His feet were bare, and his long nails, or rather claws, as I later noticed, were making that scraping noise. As soon as the stranger disappeared upstairs, I decided to follow him. Honestly, I have no idea what got into me. Usually, I would just run away like I always do. But this time, I thought I'd be brave, like some half-baked hero. This thing in a cloak went up to the second floor and disappeared into a room that was under renovation. The one with a huge hole in the roof from a zill. I was watching all this from around the corner, shaking with fear. When I peeked out from behind the door frame, I witnessed something that still gives me chills. The stranger laid the body down on the floor. Then he took off his cloak, and under it I saw huge, bat-like wings. Wrapping the corpse in the clothes he had taken off, he stood on it, grabbed the dead body with his claws, spread his wings, and flew off through a hole in the ceiling. The whole thing was completely silent. That really shook me. With trembling hands, I pulled my phone out of my pocket and called the police. As soon as they picked up, I told them everything I'd seen. There was a long silence on the other end, and then they said a crew was on the way. Literally rushing down the stairs. I gasped and hid under the table. To my horror and surprise, she was standing by the window, holding a body in her arms, looking towards the woods. Fortunately, the light was off, so she couldn't see me. I slowly got up and started watching her. She sniffed the air like she used to in the yard and began to move slowly. By that point, she had put on a cloak again, and it looked like an ordinary person was carrying a girl. I decided to follow her again. It was strange that I acted this way. My whole life I was a coward, but at the scariest moment, I decided to play the hero. We walked for no more than 5 minutes. I was running from tree to tree, and despite my clumsiness, the kidnapper didn't hear me. Soon, he suddenly stopped and dropped the body on the ground. In front of them was a huge pit. Honestly, I didn't know what it was, just a black hole. Then things got really intense. He casually took off his hat and then his cloak, and in just his brown pants, he got down on all fours and slowly started to open his mouth. First, he smiled wide like a person, and then his face began to. In a literal sense, his mouth stretched from the corners of his lips all the way to his ears, and from the nasolabial triangle to the back of his head. In that wide-open mouth, you could see tiny yellow teeth, easily visible in the moonlight. His head split in two, and his glassy gray eyes looked in different directions. He seemed like a python on all fours, slowly swallowing the leg of the deceased, savoring it as if it were a feast. His throat rumbling like a car engine. He quickly wrapped his jaws around the leg, barely moving his jaw, then suddenly stopped and jerked back, leaving only a chewed-up bone behind. By that time, my legs had gone numb, and I was whimpering like a scared puppy during a storm. Then, out of nowhere, it suddenly snapped its jaws shut, looked at me, and sniffed the air, maybe trying to figure things out by the smell of corpses so quickly. I had never run like that before. I was stumbling on my wobbly legs towards the road, but for some reason only it knew. It didn't chase after me. When I finally burst out of the tree line, the police were already waiting for me. 2 officers and a driver in a UAZ. I remember screaming and pointing at the trees. The officers listened to me, and without saying a word, rushed off. I pulled out the official file and hid under the desk, jumping at every little noise. After about half an hour, something fell loudly onto the wide windowsill, and I shot out from under the desk, screaming in terror. There was a severed head of one of the cops lying on the windowsill. The next thing I remember is running out of the morgue and bolting away. I think I either hitched a ride or took a taxi, and the next thing I knew, I was home. I have no idea what happened to the driver of the UAZ either, and honestly, I don't really care. The next morning, I gathered myself. I packed up my few savings and documents and left my hometown, leaving everything behind, my job, my house. I came to you hoping to find some sort of peace. This all happened 3 months ago. You can call me cowardly, but I'd like to see you handle it if you were in my shoes. This isn't some cheesy horror movie where the hero bravely fights off the monsters. I'm no hero, not by a long shot. I still don't know what the hell made me leave my little hideout and start following that creep. It didn't make any sense. I didn't go to the police either, scared they'd lock me up.